What's going on, everybody? I'm Jeff St. Pierre, and this is episode 152 of the Adult Education Podcast. Today, I'm speaking with journalist and author Jeremy Egner. I've been getting a little amped up with all these rumors of a new season of Ted Lasso. Now, I know it's going to be different from the original series because it won't be about all the same players and it won't have all the same cast, but I just love the idea of continuing the story in some way. Ted Lasso came on the scene kind of quietly, if we're being honest. It wasn't until a few episodes in when people really started to catch on to the brilliance of the show. I mean, it didn't help that it launched on Apple TV Plus, a new, at the time new, streaming service that was still trying to find its place in the world. But once the fire started, it was hard to slow it down. I started watching Ted Lasso on the day it premiered. I was intrigued by it and fell in love almost instantly. I think it's one of those shows that you can take at face value and really enjoy it, but there's also all these different layers to it that really show how smart and significant it is. I found that I learned a lot about leadership from the show. Like, I want Ted Lasso to be my boss. That's the kind of boss that I want. Anyway, as quickly as Ted Lasso found its way into our hearts, it was gone. The show was designed from the start to be 3 seasons long, and the creators stayed true to that, despite Apple being ready to throw tons and tons of cash at them. A few months ago, I had a chance to speak with journalist and author Jeremy Egner. He's the author of the book Believe, the Untold Story Behind Ted Lasso, the show that kicked its way into our hearts. Now, I know it's a long title, but it is so good. It's part oral history and part commentary about how the show came together and how, as the title says, it won over our hearts. I held off on using this interview until I knew the time was right to relaunch my podcast. I loved this chat so much, and I just feel like right now is the right time to share it with you. So please enjoy my conversation with Jeremy Egner.
There we go.
We've achieved basic success in the thing we've been doing for 5 years. I blame myself.
Well, Jeremy, good to talk to you. I think you're the only New York Times employee that does not have a podcast, by the way, so congrats to you.
Yeah, I guess I got to get on that. Thank you.
I was doing some research I like to get a feel for who I'm going to be talking with. And I feel like by now everyone's been on every podcast or they have their own podcast. And I was like, wow, Jeremy is actually very difficult to find out there. Your articles and your commentary is out there, but like your voice and all of that was not.
Yes. Maintaining podcast silence until this very moment.
Well, it pleases me to be the first. No, I'm just kidding. I have to say, too, I also love your tradition that you have with your daughter. I saw via Instagram where you pick her up on the first day of school, I'm guessing it is every year. Very funny. And I feel like I need to start something like that with my kid. She's going to be turning 4 soon. I'm like, I need inspiration. This is good.
Yeah, this is the time to do it. I will note that she becomes less and less cooperative as years go on. I don't know. The most recent one was just, I think she had a knife out behind me ready to sort of put an end to this whole tradition, pretty brutally. But it's fun. It's this weird visual timeline, right? Which is both like hilarious, but also just very poignant and heartbreaking as they get older. So.
I have a coworker who's older than I am. She's probably approaching 70, but she will always sort of say, like, I don't get you guys and your pictures on the first day of school and all that stuff. And I'm like, well, that's because you guys didn't have readily accessible cameras when when your kids were younger. Like, think about trying to use film to capture those pictures. Like, kids are a nightmare, but now I can take 100 pictures in 4 seconds. So yeah, we do it. We want to save these memories. I think it's great.
Yeah, I mean, truly, that's like one of the only things that keeps me in Facebook is the memories feature, sure. Right? It's like, I got a memory. I'm like, I'm a sucker every time. It sucks me right in. So.
Well, Jeremy, the book is called Believe, the Untold Story Behind Ted Lasso, the show that kicked its way into our hearts. I have to ask, before we get into the book here, how did you find yourself in TV as like a television editor? Like, what was it for you that inspired you to get into this world?
Well, I've always been a culture journalist just because growing up, music and movies and all that was really important to me. And as I started kind of pivoting towards journalism in college, I thought about what are the things that I am most interested in just organically. And that was it. And so in my 20s, I mostly wrote about music. And then, met my wife, started settling down a little bit, realized that I could cover TV from my couch. And that was, a fairly easy decision to make. I didn't have to go out every night. But also, slightly more seriously, it coincided with the time in which TV was becoming, I think arguably the most creatively fertile medium in pop culture. This was, back in Sopranos, The Wire, Mad Men, those kinds of movies or shows. And so, once I started really focusing on what people were doing and talking to some of the folks who were making it, I just found it was a really fascinating world to be a part of.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because I'm sure you've talked about this too over time. We don't really have the monoculture anymore where everybody sits down and watches. Like you think about the old episodes of Cheers or MASH or even Friends to a point where like everyone sat down every week to watch this show. We don't have things like that to the same extent. But then there are shows that pop up like a Ted Lasso that seem to be today's version of that monoculture,
Yeah, it's funny because like the show that I wrote about the most before Ted Lasso was probably Game of Thrones, which was kind of the last, I think maybe the last big example of that, in that it was a kind of cultural, like a monster consuming culture, and that every Sunday night, the recaps would blow up and people would talk about it and stuff. And, you couldn't do a more dramatic 180 to going from Game of Thrones to Ted Lasso, just totally and emotionally and all that sort of stuff. So, but yeah, I mean, Ted Lasso was an interesting story because it did become a thing that everybody was talking about, but everybody was kind of on their own schedule, right? Because it was very much, it was a streaming show, right? So very modern and contemporary in that regard, but it was kind of an old fashioned word of mouth hit, and that it sort of snuck onto TV. There weren't a lot of expectations. And, gradually the more people watched and started talking about it, started percolating on social media, then it became like this groundswell of support and enthusiasm for the show.
I think it's interesting. My wife gives me a hard time about Ted Lasso because every electronic device we have is an Apple. So we had Apple TV Plus when it first came out. And I was like, oh, I like Jason Sudeikis. This new show looks like it's going to be interesting. I'll watch the first episode when it comes out. So I was on board from day one of Ted Lasso, and she'll always make fun of me because I was the one texting my friends like, guys, you got to check out this new show, and everybody blows me off. And then like months later, hey, have you seen Ted Lasso? I'm like, yeah, scroll back. I've seen Ted Lasso. But she's like, I wish you had blown it up on social media. You could have been I'm like, it's not who I am. But it's just funny. Like it is one of those shows that doesn't feel like it picked up immediately, but it also wasn't too long. Like it still happened during the first season, I felt, while it was still ongoing. Maybe I'm wrong on that.
Yeah, no, I think that's true. I mean, when I talk to people like Sudeikis, for example, he said that, it was really when they first noticed kind of this big cultural bump was after the holidays, right? So that was several months after it came out, but it did seem like, because it premiered in August 2020, and then by the new year 2021, we had been indoors for a very long time at that point, and most of us, and so it really did feel like it kind of reached a kind of critical mass at that moment.
Yeah, even though we were indoors, there was still life happening and jobs, and so I think it's interesting that even still it takes the holidays where we all take a break to dive into a show, because I feel like that's what happens every year. There's a cycle of shows that when I get back from Christmas break, everyone's like, did you watch? Because that's when everybody catches up on their things. So it's funny that even in a time when many of us were still trapped in our homes, we still needed a holiday to really dive into a show.
Right. And I do think part of it has to do with, just like I was saying, I mean, you sound like you were an early adopter, and so congrats on your sort of cultural foresight in that regard. But I do think there was not a whole lot of expectations around the show just because it was based on an ad, which isn't, Hollywood loves IP, but that's not usually the most successful form of intellectual property to base something on, an advertisement. But it worked, right? And so the more people did see it, the more they got into the second, third, fourth episodes, and they're like, oh, this is continuing to be good and even getting better. Then that's when the word started kind of percolating through the culture.
You used the phrase cultural foresight, and I think that's interesting because even when I started watching it right from day one, I didn't notice all of the layers that were involved in the show. Like I took it, my initial memory of this is I took it at face value. Here's this sort of heartwarming comedy where there's just good-natured stuff going on. Even though there's quote unquote meanness behind the scenes, it's still not mean. Like it's still in good nature. And I loved that. I just loved that because we don't have a lot of stuff like that. But it took me some time to kind of peel back some of those layers and understand, wow, there's a lot more in this than I knew.
Yeah. I mean, it is, look, it's on its face, it's a guy with a funny mustache who says corny aphorisms in a fish out of water situation overseas, right? And just a central joke of like he's a football coach brought over to coach football that he knows nothing about, and there's lots of jokes and those kinds of things. But that was part of the clever structure of the show. Really, is to play on lots of stereotypes. It's not just Ted, who's kind of like the corny American, interloper. It's also like Jamie Tart, who's kind of the hotshot prima donna, and Rebecca Weldon, the team owner, who is kind of this bitter woman who's been jilted, and Roy Kent's a bitter old veteran. And then it peels back the layers of those people, and kind of the underlying message of all of that is that I guess it goes back to the motto of the show, right? The whole be curious, not judgmental, because we all go through our life going like, oh, that's that kind of person. That's that kind of person. Oh, I know who that is. And then it turns out when you get to know people, they can surprise you. And that's, so the show is basically inviting you to indulge your tendency to stereotype people. So you would then be surprised, when they peel back some of those layers. And then it also makes you think, well, do I do that? How often do I do that to people in my own life? And so in that way, the show bled out into the real world, right?
I think where I started to notice some more of the things that were going on, there's a big leadership undercurrent too. I mean, obviously he's a coach, but like it's just in general. And I heard an interview with Jason Sudeikis, who plays Ted Lasso, and Brendan Hunt, who plays Coach Beard. They did an interview with Brene Brown. And listening to that conversation, I was like, wow, I didn't notice all of those things they were talking about. I wish I had specific examples for you right now, but I'm sure you understand. And then going back and rewatching it going, holy crap. Like, because Brene Brown was talking about how her friends were using it in their, like her CEO friends were using it in work meetings and the way that, and I was like, wow, I never really thought about that. But yes, there's so much inspiration here for all these different aspects of life, not even just the way you were saying, looking at people, not just for face value, but understanding what's there behind the scenes, but even just the way you talk to people and you build them up and you bring them to be a part of something. There's so much inspiration in that show.
Yeah. And when they were first hiring writers, right, to develop the show, start writing it, I mean, one of the things that Jason Sudeikis would ask prospective writers is like, tell me about your mentors. And from the beginning, this idea of mentorship and the importance of it and how it sort of helps people reach, I guess their better selves, for lack of a better word, it was baked into it from the very beginning.
I think Jason Sudeikis is a very interesting case because I think there are people that we as fans watch on TV and we want them to be those characters. Like Jason Sudeikis over time has always been this goofy comedian, kind of plays the best buddy. That's like the silly guy that brings the laughs in. But then when you talk to him in real life and you see him doing interviews, pretty serious guy, like still has humor, but he's a pretty serious guy. And I'm always like, that's so interesting because it's not the person who I always expect him to be in those settings.
Right. Yeah. I mean, obviously he came to most people's attention through Saturday Night Live, playing lots of really, doing funny dances and those, what's up with that sketches, which by the way, was the Ted Lasso dance, an early version of the Ted Lasso dance we later see on the show. But yeah, he's a really thoughtful dude. And clearly had been thinking, one of the things they talk about in the conversation about how, this landed as a kind of beacon for people during the pandemic. And it was, provided a sense of emotional uplift at a really tough time, and so, they'll talk about, yeah, that's great. But we've been talking about these things for a long time. We've been thinking about how sour discourse had gotten, whether it's on social media, I mean, often on social media, but just in our sort of interactions and the polarization within our society and our communities. So they have been giving that a lot of thought and talking about this sort of for years before the pandemic. And it just so happened to land at a time in which we were sort of uniquely susceptible to that kind of message, I think.
You use the word beacon, I think, a couple of times in this conversation, and I have not finished the book, so I have not gotten all the way, to the very end. Yeah. But I remember when season 3 came out, there was some pushback from fans because I think fans thought they were diving into some topics that maybe they weren't prepared for. And it seemed like that beacon may have been dimming for a lot of people. Is that something that they caught on? Is that something that they addressed? I know these shows are largely filmed before, entirely filmed before they hit the airwaves anyway. So it's kind of tough to go back and edit. But I wonder if in your conversations, if they addressed that at all.
Well, I mean, yeah, I think, the first 2 seasons were basically made in a bubble, right? When they're making the first season, nobody had heard of it. Obviously, it had never come out, so they were just sort of off on their own in London doing it. And then they made most of the second season right on the heels of that in sort of pandemic lockdown, right? And so it wasn't really until the third season that that it was coming back as a hit show, and they were sort of making it as a hit show. So, I mean, certainly they were aware of those expectations, but they said we couldn't think about them because we just have to make the show we want to make. We got to tell the story we want to tell, and we can't worry about what other people think about it. And yeah, this season, that third season, was a lot more polarizing. Some people just outright disliked it. Some of the headlines that came out halfway through were just like, Ted Lasso is not a good show anymore. Those kinds of things. I never sort of went. I mean, I will say that it was my least favorite of the seasons, but I never went so far as to say that now this show, sucks, which is a thing that was coming up. But to the end, they were kind of like, we made the show we want to make, and if people like it, great. If they didn't like it, I mean, this was the story we wanted to tell. There were some specific complaints people had that I thought were pretty valid. I mean, some of the plotting was a little uneven.
Sure.
They spent sort of too much time on certain things, like the weird Keeley subplot with her own agency, and not enough time on Nate the Great sort of redemption. That seemed a little rushed. So you can sort of pick apart all sorts of specific choices that you might not agree with, but I think on the whole, they sort of landed where they wanted to land from the beginning, and sort of were true to the vision of the show to the end.
Yeah, I won't talk about the Coach Beard episode, of course. We can leave that one out of the whole thing. But I
have
do
a whole chapter about that one, actually, because that was such a polarizing episode.
Yeah. And as much as I love Coach Beard, I was like, I don't know if we needed a whole episode of this, but that's besides the point, I guess. But I do think what's cool about, and I think one of my favorite things about the streaming era that has come in is I think there are shows that are willing to A, have shorter seasons, and B, there are shows that are willing to say, we want 3 seasons and we're done. Not every show needs to be Grey's Anatomy and have 37 seasons. You don't have to have all of that. Sometimes the story is done after, I wish Lost only did 3 seasons. We lost a lot in those last couple of seasons, I feel like they had that vision, and I appreciate that they said, we're done at 3. We're not going to extend it.
Yeah. And, now there is talk with them making more, and we'll see sort of what comes
But if it comes back in its own entity, right? A different entity in its own way. So I don't even really think of that as it's like House of the Dragon or whatever. It's its own entity that's tied to that world, but it's still separate.
Yeah. I mean, I expect it will be. I mean, look, we know that it will be a different story in some way, right? Because the thing they always said from the very beginning was, this is a 3-season story. It wasn't. They were never very cagey about it. They're never like, we'll see. I mean, from the beginning, Sudeikis like, yeah, this is a 3-season story, and they stuck to that, right? And so they are to be applauded, especially because, I mean, they're making the show for the richest company in the history of humankind. I'm sure at various points there was kind of conversations around okay, how big does the check need to be? And we will just write it, because it's still the biggest show that Apple's ever had. And I'm sure they would have taken as much. I mean, I know that they were, Tim Cook visited the set, in season 3, and sort of the implication was yeah, we'd love to have as much of this as you want to keep doing. So I do think there was a lot of pressure to sort of keep it going, and to their credit, they stuck to their guns and to their plan, and landed the plane in the way they wanted to do it.
You talk about in the book that Jason Sudeikis was not necessarily the first choice to be a part of this. And I'm thinking about it, wondering if it would have had the same impact with someone that we all knew better. I think Jason had been around, and I think he was a familiar face, but he wasn't really ever the quote unquote star of something. He was always a part of things, but he wasn't. Yeah. It's I wonder if we had taken one of the other names that you had mentioned, put them in, they were bigger names. So I wonder, I don't know. I feel like Jason and that crew, I think that was the right choice looking at it.
Yeah. And I think there's also just, I mean, you're talking about when they were casting the original commercial, right?
Yeah.
Which was the origin of the whole thing. NBC Sports had picked up the Premier League, and then they wanted to have a viral ad, to sort of celebrate that. And the Coach Lasso character was created for that. And yeah, they had other people John Oliver and even Chris Pratt, people like that in mind to play that character in those ads. So yeah, obviously we're talking about a very different show at that point, but I also just think probably a show doesn't even happen, right? If there's something about the experience that Sudeikis went through making this ad with Brendan Hunt, who we now know as Coach Beard, and Joe Kelly, and those 3 guys had all been together in various comedy theaters, and they had the vision for the character in the beginning, and then after they did the ad, they kept talking about it because there's something here that's really interesting. And so I think it was the combination of those creators still being in conversation even after the ads were over, that kind of, I mean, I know that is what led to the show, right? So if it was another person who played that character, probably it's just we have the ads and we haven't thought about them in 10 years. But now we have this whole other thing.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. I'm so glad they went back to it. I'm so glad that Bill Lawrence got involved too, because obviously you've been involved in TV longer than I have, but just as a TV watcher, there's not many things he's done that I haven't appreciated. Like Scrubs is still one of my top 5 all-time shows. I mean, he's got such a great track listing, and then he comes out with Ted Lasso.
Yeah. Yeah. And, Scrubs is an interesting sort of predecessor for Ted Lasso because it does similarly mash up kind of like, funny, wacky comedy and, heart, right? It's like you have those things side by side throughout that entire show. And so very much similar to Ted Lasso in that regard. But yeah, he's just a great maker of television. You know what I mean? He's like his first big show is Spin City.
Yep.
Which is also a big hit with Michael J. Fox and then Charlie Sheen. And he's, had other shows that like Whiskey Cavalier, which was like not a successful show, but was a good show. Mm-hmm. Interesting thing with him though, is like, he did have those big hits, but he was on a bit of a dry streak before Ted Lasso. And so that has kind of brought him back, into prominence in a way.
We talk about redemption with the show in general, but, looking at the people that are involved, it almost felt like a redemptive story for a lot of them. Like you just mentioned, Bill Lawrence had kind of been a little quiet around this time. This show comes back and puts him right back on the map. Now he's got Shrinking, he's got Bad Monkey, and seems to be riding high on what's going on. There are characters in the show. I mean, Jason Sudeikis himself hadn't had like a big, massive success leading into Ted Lasso. Rebecca Waddingham was a face that most Americans were not super familiar. I mean, I think the most familiar thing they knew was that one Game of Thrones scene, which seems like such a minor thing, but like that was, even Juno Temple. I mean, there are people that had some moments but hadn't fully broken out, and then Ted Lasso comes in and it's like it reinvigorates so much for all these amazingly talented folks.
Yeah, I mean, I talk about in the book how it was like an underdog story told by underdogs, right? It was like all these people who, as you just explained, I mean, they, if we knew them, we kind of knew them for specific things. They certainly weren't stars. They weren't on most people's radars. Certainly not, Juno Temple, has been a well-regarded actress for a long time, but nobody thought of her as like a comic performer, for example. Hannah Waddingham, like you say, she was known basically for the shame scene in Game of Thrones. But she had been this big star in the West End for decades. And so, but American audiences still didn't know her that well. Brett Goldstein was a kind of a journeyman comic performer and writer in Britain, again, for decades. But, you give him Roy Kent and suddenly he's this huge star and he's, got development deals and everything coming off the back of it. So it was a huge career boost for all these folks who all, as far as I can tell, talking to a lot of them, seem like real decent people. So it's kind of, even the story of the show, in addition to the story in the show, is pretty heartwarming itself.
I think that's, it's weird to say this, but it almost makes me annoyed at how good all the people seem and how good the show is. I'm like, one of you has to be an asshole. And I don't know which one it's going to be, but one of you has to be.
I would have loved to have some asshole stories, I asked around, I'm like, certainly somebody was freaking out, and behind the throwing things in the trailer, doing something. And to a person, they're like, no, it was actually really, even during the pandemic, even when the shoot stretched longer than we thought it was going to be, it's like people were pretty happy. They were pretty grateful. They knew what the show was doing for their careers.
Yeah, I kind of love that. So the book itself is kind of an oral history. It's not a full oral history. Like it's not just all commentary from folks, but I always find an oral history book to be a very interesting undertaking because it must take you forever to go through all of these interviews and all of these notes and all of this audio and everything. Is it, when you're doing this, is it only the things that you did? Are you only looking at your interviews? Are you pulling from other sources? How does that work?
I've sort of pulled from kind of all over for this one because it was like the new interviews I did for the book. But then, I had interviewed a lot of these folks for the Times while the show was on. And, you only use like 1% of any interview you ever do in the article. And so, I had all this sort of, cutting room floor stuff that was really great for the book. And then because this show came out in the pandemic, they did all of these awards panels and all of these sort of virtual interview series. And there was just so much stuff out there, but it was all, it was all good stuff. So I just tried to cast as wide a net as possible. And then, just drill down on what would be, interesting and also work in the narrative of, telling the story of the show. And then it was just like creating Google Docs, grabbing chunks, putting them in there. And it was almost like a puzzle, essentially. So that part's actually kind of fun because, when you're sitting down to write something, sometimes you can make yourself crazy just inside your own head. So when you have to assemble something in more of like an active way, it's almost a slightly easier way to write because it's more externally focused. Not to get too into the weeds on it, but
no, I'm fascinated by oral history books in general. Like I've got a bunch about music scene. Actually, Andy Green, who wrote the one about The Office, he praised your book on the back cover of your book, and I was going back thinking about that. Like, that book, The Office book, feels like a dictionary. I mean, there's so much.
It was great, but it was so big.
It's a lot. It's got to be a huge undertaking to go through all of the commentary, as you said, and the interviews and the conversations. I mean, I praise you for being able to do it.
Thanks very much. And yeah, as you say, it wasn't entirely oral history. It was like the oral history sort of serves as the spine of it. And just a sort of sidebar, it's like we talked about 3 seasons, right? Being glad that a show could be 3 seasons. I was very glad for that purpose that the show's only 3 seasons because that keeps the, chronology somewhat manageable. The spine of it was oral history, but then in between, I also wanted to dive into some of the the themes and the backstories of some of these people who are on the show a little more deeply. And also just kind of break it up and give more variety. And so, it's oral history interspersed with little essays, kind of mostly jumping off episodes, talking about the themes of the show and some of the backstories of these people who are involved.
Yeah, and you always find inside information as a fan. I think that's kind of fun to see some of these stories that we wouldn't know. Like there's one in here about Hannah Waddingham. There's that scene in the first season where they go to the karaoke bar and she sings Let It Go. And reading that story about how she was like, no, I'm not singing this song. I'm not like that. To me was very fascinating to see how that whole thing kind of developed.
Yeah, she was like, like my daughter is now 14, which means she was about 2 or 3 when Frozen came out. I've heard Let It Go 18 gajillion times. And lots of people are kind of in that same boat. And so I think as a vocalist, she was like, this song has been nailed. Everybody's singing it. I don't ever want to do it. But then once Sudeikis kind of laid out, like, this is why this is the perfect song for this moment. But if you can come up with a better one, let me know and we can talk about it. And she went and thought about it and she's like, damn it, he's right. And so she of course knocked it out of the park. And the people who are in there, while they're filming the scene is like, yeah, you see it on TV and it's amazing. Being in the room was even more amazing. It's like you see all the reactions in the show. It's like those are real reactions of people just being blown away by the power of this amazing singer. And so I think it was just a neat moment all the way around.
Even talking about it kind of gives me goosebumps because I remember that scene so well. And it took me back to going to New York to visit friends of mine. And I had never been to a karaoke bar before that had separate rooms that you could have like a little party with your friends, which was great. I was grateful for. I was like, oh, this is good. I will actually have the guts to stand in front of my 10 friends and sing a song. What I didn't realize is that I would be the first one to sing. And then my friends brought people from Broadway to our room. So when they start singing, I'm like, wow, I wish I had gone last. So I would have known to leave before my turn. Because when I'm singing a really crappy version of Mariah Carey's All I Want for Christmas Is You, and then somebody sings Josh Groban's You Raise Me Up better than Josh Groban can, you feel very out of place. But I just, yeah, you're right. I mean, it's such a powerful moment in the show. And I sometimes you want to be in the room where it happens to coin a phrase, but I would have loved to be there for that.
Yeah, definitely. And it's kind of funny because they weren't sure they before they did that, or when they shot that scene, they didn't yet have the rights to the song. So they didn't know if they'd be able to get the rights, right? And so to have a backup, she also sang I Will Survive. Okay. And so it's funny to think about how much different that scene would be, with that song instead of Let It Go. So.
It doesn't have the same feeling to me, I don't think. So I'm glad they got the rights to that.
Yeah.
Jeremy, favorite scene, favorite moment off the top of your head from the series?
Well, I mean, honestly, we are talking about that episode. That is still my favorite episode. Yeah. That's the 7th episode of season 1. And I think that was when I was first watching it. That's kind of when I realized, oh, the show is a lot more sophisticated and a lot like deeper than I thought, because you had all these different, storylines coming together. That was when, remember, Ted had to sign his divorce papers. So he's having this sort of emotional breakdown. That was the first time he had the big panic attack. That's when you start to see, Nate come out of his shell. Because remember, there's the scene in the locker room where he's like dressing down the entire team. Mm-hmm. It's hilarious, but it's also like you realize later, oh, that was the first glimpse of like his darker side. Mm-hmm. And so you had all of these things interwoven in this really elegant way that it's still my favorite episode. So
I have to go with the gala episode in season 1. Oh, yeah. I think when Ted brings the musician off the street to come in, that was just like, that's the moment I was like, oh my God, like that really pulled me in at that point.
And also, Brett Goldstein, for example, said the same thing. Basically, he's like,
Oh, really?
when we were shooting 4, because I think it's the fourth episode of the first season, and he's like seeing everybody, like, I think it was just sort of the read through right before they were even filming. They're like looking around. He's like, everybody's got their characters down. This is really coming together. And then the director who shot that, he's like, that's when you started seeing everybody kind of coming into their own as performers, and you see, Roy and Jamie have a kind of a little duet thing, and he's like, oh, that's gonna be a cool thing. You used to have like Keely and Rebecca having a little bonding moment, and so you're starting to see all the various dynamics that are going to basically define the show kind of come into their own. And so, yes, that is an awesome one as well.
Well, Jeremy, great work of art. I loved reliving the show through the book. As I said, I haven't finished it yet, but I am working on it. And I love hearing the commentary from the people that were involved. I think you tied things together so well with your work here. So my hat is off to you. The book is called Believe, the Untold Story Behind Ted Lasso, the show that kicked its way into our hearts. Jeremy, is there a place that people listening can go to find out more about you if they want to read more of your work or anything?
Sure. I mean, you can go to nytimes.com and, you just click on my name and they'll have everything that I've ever done there. I'm also on the various social platforms, X, I guess we call it now, and Instagram. I'm not terribly active, but I'm there. And yeah, buy the book wherever you like to buy books. That's all I can say.
Jeremy, thank you so much, man. I appreciate it.
Thanks very much. I appreciate it.
Big thank you to Jeremy Egner for his time. His book, Believe, the Untold Story Behind Ted Lasso, the show that kicked its way into our hearts, is available now wherever you get your books. It is such a feel-good story, much like the show was. The stories from the cast members and everyone involved really just warm my heart. It's the kind of happiness that I need right now, given everything that's happening in the world. Anyway, thank you for listening to Adult Education this week. Until next time, be well.